So we're moving on to our second unit on Scripture. And the three readings you have for this unit are all by contemporary Scripture scholars. You have a reading, two of them Anglican, one of them Methodist. You have a reading from Ellen Davis, who is the Old Testament professor at Duke. You have a reading from Chris Seitz, who is the Old Testament professor at Wycliffe. And you have a reading from Richard Hayes, who is Methodist, and the New Testament professor at Duke. And what I want us to do in our class is develop a typology of how each of them approaches scriptures. Each of the readings I gave you are by people who take scripture very seriously, who think scripture should inform moral reflection and action, and who are committed to reading scripture not simply as a rule book, but reading scripture holistically. So looking at all of scripture together, what is the narrative of scripture in which our understanding of how to live life is formed. They're all committed to a strong relationship between the Old and New Testament. They don't want to read the New Testament at the expense of the Old. They think that our reading of the New Testament has to be informed by the Old. And none of them are naive in the sense that they think that this task is easy. They don't think that we can just go in and proof text or cherry pick our way to moral understanding from Scripture. They see the challenges in Scripture. They recognize them in different ways. And so their goal in each of these readings is to advance a constructive theory of how Christians can engage with Scripture, why Scripture matters, and how do we talk about the problematic moral issues which arise in Scripture. So we're going to spend our time in class really diving into the methodologies that each of them provide to help us read Scripture holistically, help us read Scripture for moral development, help us take seriously the fact that Scripture was written in a different culture and for different people, but also see Scripture in one form or another as divine revelation. They're not going to agree with each other. I mean, they have these basic foundational ideas that I went through, but they will, I think, and you may not agree with them. You may not like them all, but this is, in my mind, the best of scriptural scholarship engaging with moral issues out there, and particularly doing this from an Anglican perspective. So that's going to be our focus of our class. I'm going to give a little history background to sort of how we get from the patristic period to here, and what are other things that I think we need to pick up from the history of reading Scripture with the church. So we had in our discussion of the patristic period the sense of that Scripture, the study of Scripture, both reads us and we read Scripture, that there's this mutual cyclical kind of reinforcing cycle of growth and development and virtue, which leads to better interpretation of Scripture, and then Scripture informs that moral growth. The other element, which we did not focus on as much, or at least I didn't in the lecture, I hope we may in our class discussion, is the fact that when the fathers came to Scripture, they did not give up on all of the tools that they had been developed in, that they had developed and been formed in their classical education. Of course, we see this most strongly in people like Ambrose and Augustine, who were formed in the Greek and Roman classical tradition. They are not uncritically bringing in ideas from this pagan culture, but they don't 100% reject it either. They don't see that they see a road to walk in which in which a serious conviction about the importance of Scripture for moral formation does not mean giving up all forms of natural knowledge, all forms of the experiential knowledge, although they are always careful to make sure that they're not saying that what Scripture provides is a morally neutral insight that would be available to anybody. They know this very well, being formed, having been fully formed and educated in the classical tradition. And I think it's important as Christians to make sure that we hold on to the primacy of Scripture, and that Scripture contributes, is the norming norm for moral formation. We don't have to give up the importance of these other sources of knowledge to help us understand Scripture, to help us understand the moral choices that we make in our life. So we see the kind of this beginning approach in the patristic period, and this synthetic reading of Scripture with other sources of moral knowledge becomes even more important in the scholastic period. I just want to highlight these elements for you because we are going to be spending some time later on in the course with Thomas Aquinas. So following the fall of the Roman Empire and the growth of a medieval Christian culture in Europe, the theologians working in what were called the schools, which were the kind of precursors to modern universities and the places of theological formation, had some key epistemological convictions. First, they saw sources from antiquity, whether pagan or early Christian, as crucial sources of knowledge. So they made it they had a sense that all truth is God's truth. And so they made it their goal to read all of the books that had survived, that had been held on to monasteries, that copied and circulated, read the truth from those books in dialogue with Scripture. They thought that that their reading of Scripture should be informed by natural philosophy like Aristotle, by theories of rhetoric, by understanding justice such as they found in Cicero. They didn't assume that there was a conflict, but they also weren't scared that these secular sources of knowledge were going to colonize scriptural interpretation in a way that took away from the significance of scriptural interpretation as revelation and as the ultimate norm. They actually saw the dialogue between these sources of knowledge and Scripture as a process of reasoning that leads to truth, that they felt that they could put these different sources into discussion and understand truth more deeply. So there isn't a secular religious conflict, rather all knowledge is God's knowledge, and it's the act of dialogue and discussion that helps us go deeper into Scripture and deeper into understanding ourselves. And this is the idea that lays the basis for the modern university, for the whole education system we have now, the idea that you gain truth through drawing on multiple sources, and that it's a process of dialogue and discussion that leads to further examination and further growth. And of course, the sort of most important compilation of this, looking back, that we would say is the Summa of St. Thomas Aquinas, which we will spend, Summa Theologica, which we're spending a lot more time talking about. But basically, this is a intro theological textbook that St. Thomas set up to replicate this dialogical system. And here's how St. Thomas lays the groundwork for this dialogue of revelation and experiential or scientific knowledge or natural knowledge in the prima parts, which we won't be looking at. So we learn because God exposes himself to us. We figure out how to engage in the world through God's revelation. So we begin with God as Christians. We begin with our discussion of our true end. But once we've established our true end from a relationship with God, we can look inward. Augustine does this a lot too, to learn more about ourselves, to learn more about what type of people we are, how we can be formed, to see the image of God within ourselves, to understand these natural inclinations that we've been talking about, and to sort of see how our capacities point, even though marred with sin, at God. We ask the questions about our actions. We look outside. How do our relationships shape us? How does our experience in the world, how do the other things we've read help us dialogue with God's revelation, God's gift of himself, to help us arrive at a greater source of truth for moral formation? We look at our emotions. Emotions are very important to St. Thomas. What do our emotions tell us about the good? And what are the principles that guide our actions? What are the things, the habits, the virtues, the grace that is pointing us towards one action or another? And it's only out of this dialogue between God's revelation, our knowledge of ourselves, and our other experiences in the world that we can again begin to engage in this process of moral formation and moral development. So really in the Middle Ages, there's what we call the Thomistic synthesis, an understanding that all knowledge is God's knowledge, and the key is to figure out how to relate the different sources of knowledge to each other. So fast forward, remember our emphasis on nominalism. We discussed nominalism in the first unit where we talked about William of Ockham and this idea that true freedom of indifference, means that we can't have anything else influencing our free choice. It just has to be a completely, totally free, spontaneous choice. And that God's freedom is like this too. So you can see the contrast between morality as this dialogue between revelation and all these other sources of knowledge, and dialogue, and then the idea of true freedom, only being preserved if you have sola scriptura, revelation without anything else. Revelation as law, rather than revelation being given through lots of sources and moral formation being developed as dialogue. And of course, as we mentioned, we have the situation, the kind of development of ideas through Kant, who takes this law-only approach and removes it from revelation and says we can find the answers to this only within ourselves. For Kant, this is reason. You can see how for other people in contemporary thought, this is developed as more of an emotive approach. I have to figure out what I feel or what I think my identity is, and that's going to drive all the rest of my interpretation, rather than Aquinas' approach, which is that we have to synthesize everything with revelation taking preeminence. And so I've sort of said this is how we have this development of either Scripture standing by itself or natural knowledge retreats back into Scripture, and losing this emphasis on God's revelation in lots of different ways, coming together in a synthetic reading towards moral formation. I think that a benefit of retrieving, as part of our point with looking at these different sources and talking about these different sources, a more synthetic reading of moral formation as opposed to one that says only experience, only reason, or only Scripture interpreted as a law book, is that this approach holds together both a love of the world, but also a skepticism of the world, an awareness that we are, as we talked about, impacted by sin and how we arrive at our moral choices, but that there is a lot of God's goodness still in the world, and that if we're saying morality is about beatitude, or in the sense that morality is about happiness, about God making us who we are and who we are called to be, it is important to look at who we are and to understand ourselves and to understand the world around us, and that we are engaged in a synthetic reading. This, of course, also means, and this gets us back to our contemporary authors who we'll be talking about in this session, that we don't need to be afraid of things like the historical critical method, things like the scientific study of Scripture. I think it can, when we're exposed to this, we can want to grab on really tightly to a very kind of naive and simplistic reading of Scripture, because we're afraid we're going to lose our moral compass. We're going to lose Scripture as a rule book if we look at these questions about cultural context or historical context or the development of the scriptural text. Rather, and this is what I think Hayes, Davis, and Seitz on their own way are trying to do, we can see even the process of growth and development as God's revelation, that we're free to look at that and understand that to help us understand the synthesis, the synthetic approach to reading Scripture for moral formation, rather than seeing that this means we have to be Kantian or secularist and throw revelation